Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that your nation, your soldiers, your friends, your family, has stepped into a conflict that will redefine an entire generation. A war that won't just be fought in the jungles of Southeast Asia, but in the minds, memories, and nightmares of millions of Americans for decades to come. This is the story of the Vietnam War. But before we step into the dense, humid jungles of Vietnam, into a conflict that reshaped American politics, society, and identity, there's one thing you need to know. Just 2 years before this war began, the United States had already fought a brutal and exhausting conflict, the Korean War. If you haven't watched that documentary yet, the link is waiting for you in the description. Make sure you check out afterward, because the Korean War explains exactly how America walked into Vietnam with a mindset, fears, and strategies that shaped everything to come. The year is 1954. The Korean War has ended, the Cold War is intensifying, and the United States government is becoming increasingly convinced that communism is spreading like wildfire. America isn't just worried about territory. It's worried about something far deeper: ideology, ideas crossing borders, governments falling, a chain reaction that could reshape world power. And then one sentence changes everything. If Vietnam falls, all of Southeast Asia falls next. This becomes known as a domino theory, and it becomes one of the most influential and controversial foreign policy beliefs in U.S. history. Washington decides Vietnam cannot be allowed to fall. After the First Indochina War, Vietnam is split in two: North Vietnam Communist, led by Ho Chi Minh; South Vietnam anti-communist government backed by the U.S. At first, America sends money, advisors, equipment, and intelligence. No full-scale war. Not yet. To the U.S. government, Vietnam seems like a small country with a small conflict, something manageable, something preventable. But the ground reality is far more complicated. Vietnam is a nation fighting not just a political battle, but an identity battle. North Vietnam sees the fight as liberation. South Vietnam sees it as survival. And America sees it as responsibility. A dangerous triangle is forming. Throughout the late 1950s, tension rises like a slow-burning fuse. Guerrilla fighters known as the Viet Cong begin attacking South Vietnam. The U.S. increases its support, believing its presence will stabilize the region. But instead of calming the fire, it begins to spread. Villages become battlegrounds. Roads become targets. Democracy becomes a battlefield. America's involvement is no longer a question of if, but how far. Washington faces pressure from military advisors, political leaders, and Cold War strategists. Everyone fears the same thing: another Korea. A war America cannot afford to lose. A war that will test loyalty, strategy, and national willpower. The true turning point arrives in August 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident. North Vietnamese patrol boats confront a U.S. Navy destroyer. Shots are fired. Reports flood Washington. Panic spreads. Whether the events happen exactly as reported becomes a controversy that lasts for decades. But for the U.S. government, the decision is immediate. America will strike back. Congress passes a Gulf of Tonkin resolution, giving President Lyndon B. Johnson full authority to begin military operations in Vietnam. This is the moment the Vietnam War truly begins. Thousands of U.S. troops prepare for deployment. Families prepare for goodbye. A new chapter of American history begins, one that will shape politics, identity, culture, and memory for generations. For the United States, the Vietnam War becomes far more than a foreign conflict. It becomes a national test of strategy, leadership, morality, patriotism, public trust. It divides communities, sparks protests, and forces Americans to question the meaning of war itself. Soldiers return home to a country that is confused, angry, and divided. It becomes the first war Americans watch unfold on television, broadcast directly into living rooms across the nation, and the world will never see war the same way again. The Vietnam War didn't explode overnight. It grew, slowly, steadily, like a storm gathering strength across the horizon. And when it finally hit, it hit with a force the United States never fully expected. The moment the U.S. decided to escalate its involvement, the conflict changed from a regional struggle into one of the most defining wars of the 20th century. This segment uncovers how America went from sending advisors to sending hundreds of thousands of troops into one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth after the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in 1964. President Lyndon B. Johnson had full authority to take all necessary measures in Vietnam. To the American public, it sounded like a defensive move, a measured response, a protective step. But behind closed doors, the Pentagon was already preparing something far bigger. March 1965, the first combat troops arrive. The U.S. Marines land at Da Nang, not as advisors, not as trainers, but as combat soldiers. For many Americans, this was the moment they realized we're officially in this war. Washington believed a strong military presence would break enemy morale and stabilize South Vietnam. But the truth? Vietnam was unlike any battleground the U.S. had ever faced. The jungles of Vietnam were alive, unpredictable, silent, deadly. U.S. troops found themselves in dense forests where visibility dropped to just a few feet. The heat was suffocating. Humidity clung to every breath. And beneath the earth were elaborate tunnel systems carved by the Viet Cong, some stretching for miles. American soldiers weren't fighting an enemy that stood in front of them. They were fighting one that lived in the shadows, moved silently, and struck without warning. This wasn't Europe. This wasn't Korea. This was something completely different. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army were disciplined, patient, and highly strategic. They used guerrilla warfare, hit-and-run attacks, traps, tunnels, and ambushes. Their knowledge of terrain gave them an advantage that aircraft, tanks, and technological superiority couldn't erase. To American troops, it often felt like fighting a ghost. Booby traps, punji pits, tripwires, hidden explosives, asterisk, asterisk. Every step meant risk. Every path could be the last. Even elite American soldiers quickly realized this was a war of endurance, not equipment. In early 1965, the U.S. launched one of the largest sustained bombing campaigns in world history, Operation Rolling Thunder. For 3 years, American aircraft unleashed high-explosive bombs, napalm strikes, cluster munitions, anti-personnel bombs, defoliants like Agent Orange. The skies above Vietnam roared with jets and bombers, and the ground shook under relentless fire. Washington believed this would cripple North Vietnam's supply lines and morale. But the Vietnamese were resilient, tactically brilliant. They adapted. They hid deeper underground. They dispersed. They rebuilt faster than expected. Operation Rolling Thunder didn't break the North. It hardened them. Instead of capturing territory, American forces moved through jungles and villages searching for Viet Cong fighters. Once found, they engaged quickly, inflicted maximum casualties, and moved on. On paper, it made sense. In practice, it created chaos. Many villages became battlegrounds. Civilians were caught in crossfire. Confusion became common. And with the Viet Cong blending among local populations, trust became nearly impossible. Another issue emerged. Washington measured progress through body counts, not territory gained. This put enormous pressure on commanders and often created misleading or unreliable reports of success. The result? A widening gap between the battlefield reality and what was being told the American public. The Vietnam War was the first major conflict where helicopters became the heart of military operations. The UH-1 Huey, now an icon, transformed battle mobility. Troops inserted directly into active combat zones. Casualties evacuated within minutes. Supplies and reinforcements delivered rapidly. Air cavalry units created for fast assaults. Vietnam became known as the Helicopter War. The thump-thump-thump of Huey rotors became the soundtrack of American operations. But while helicopters brought new advantages, they also became prime targets. Many were shot down. Many soldiers never made it back. American troops soon faced their first large-scale engagements. November 1965, the Battle of Ia Drang. This battle became a brutal preview of what the war would become. Fierce close combat, massive casualties, surrounded American forces, air support saving entire units, North Vietnamese proving they could fight head-to-head. IA Drang showed the U.S. something critical. This war would not be won easily. It marked a moment when Washington realized it wasn't fighting a small guerrilla force, but a determined, organized, and highly skilled army. Back home, something unprecedented happened. For the first time in history, Americans watched the war on television. Every night, news anchors showed helicopter landings, villages burning, soldiers fighting in rice fields, body bags being transported, the harsh, raw, unfiltered reality of war. This wasn't the heroic imagery of World War II. It wasn't the patriotic duty of Korea. This was real, emotional, confusing, controversial. As casualties increased, questions began to rise. But at this point, Washington was fully committed. The U.S. was now neck-deep in a conflict that was growing bigger every month by the end of 1966. Over 400,000 American troops were in Vietnam. The nation was officially in a full-scale war, and the world knew it. What began as a small advisory mission had transformed into one of the most intense military commitments in American history. As American involvement deepened, Vietnam transformed from a distant conflict into one of the most intense battlegrounds the United States had ever faced. The mid-war years, roughly 1966 through 1968, became the turning point of the entire conflict. They were years defined by massive troop increases, new tactics, technological innovation, and some of the bloodiest confrontations the U.S. military had ever encountered. This was a part of the war where every decision carried enormous consequences, and every mile of jungle became a test of human endurance. By 1967, the United States had deployed hundreds of thousands of soldiers into Vietnam. Young men, barely out of high school, stepped into a world they had never imagined. Thick jungles, unbearable humidity, an enemy they rarely saw until the moment of ambush. Helicopters sliced through the sky, delivering platoons into open fields, riverbanks, and thick forests. Dust flew, rotor blades thundered, and soldiers ran with their heads low, not knowing what waited beyond the tree line. Vietnam was unpredictable. No two missions looked the same, and no amount of training fully prepared a soldier for the reality he met on the ground. Life in the jungle was relentless. Days blurred together through sweat, fatigue, and constant tension. The Viet Cong's traps turned every path into a threat. A single footstep could trigger a hidden explosive, a bamboo pit, or a tripwire grenade. Soldiers learned to scan the ground constantly, moving slowly, carefully, sometimes advancing only a few yards an hour. The jungle swallowed sound, absorbed footsteps, and hid movement. American soldiers often describe it as fighting inside a living maze, one built to disorient, confuse, and punish. And then, there were the battles that defined the war's brutality. Firefights erupted without warning. One second the jungle was silent, and the next, gunfire cracked through the trees like lightning. Helicopters swooped overhead, pilots dodging enemy fire as they tried to evacuate the wounded. Some days, entire units would be pinned down for hours, fighting for inches of ground while calling for air support that couldn't always reach them in time. Soldiers rarely saw the Viet Cong until they were dangerously close, often within just a few yards. It was a kind of warfare that demanded constant awareness and mental resilience. American commanders believed superior firepower would eventually break the enemy. Artillery batteries roared day and night, and bombers dropped massive payloads on suspected enemy positions. Entire stretches of forest were cleared through explosives and chemical defoliants, turning green landscapes into gray wastelands. The plan was simple: weaken the enemy's ability to hide, move, and resupply. But North Vietnamese forces adapted quickly. They shifted through underground tunnels, moved supplies at night, and scattered in small units that were almost impossible to target from the air. Helicopters became the beating heart of the American strategy. They were not just transportation, they were lifelines. They delivered troops into combat, carried out reconnaissance, transported ammunition, and rescued the wounded. Pilots pushed themselves to the limit, flying into hot zones under heavy fire. Many helicopters never made it back. Many crews paid the ultimate price trying to save others. But without helicopters, the war would have been nearly impossible for the U.S. to sustain. For soldiers on the ground, the distant thumping of rotor blades meant hope, rescue, and survival. As U.S. operations intensified, one thing became clear. The enemy was far more prepared than Washington expected. The North Vietnamese army was well-trained, disciplined, and determined. They countered American technology with patient strategy and deep knowledge of the terrain. They fought at night, vanished during the day, and attacked when U.S. forces were least prepared. Their willingness to endure massive losses shocked American commanders. What was expected to be a quick demonstration of U.S. power was turning into a prolonged war against an enemy who simply refused to break. Then came 1968, a year that changed everything. On the morning of the Lunar New Year, known as Tet, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched a massive, coordinated offensive across South Vietnam. Cities, bases, embassy grounds, and villages erupted in violence. It was one of the most ambitious attacks of the entire war, executed with precision and surprise. American troops fought fiercely to regain control, pushing back wave after wave of enemy soldiers. Street-to-street combat exploded in major cities, something the U.S. military had never expected in Vietnam. The Tet Offensive became one of the most dramatic turning points in the war. Not because the U.S. lost militarily, but because the scale of the attack shocked the American public watching from home. Television brought the war into American living rooms every night. Images of chaos, destruction, and casualties played across the screen, creating a divide between official government reports and what people believed they were seeing with their own eyes. Confidence in the war effort began to erode. Families questioned the cost. Students protested. Veterans returned home disillusioned and exhausted, struggling to explain what they had witnessed. The nation entered a period of emotional conflict, unsure whether victory was possible or even meaningful. On the ground in Vietnam, soldiers continued to fight daily. They patrolled through rice fields, trudged through rivers, climbed mountains, and engaged in firefights that lasted hours. Friendships were formed through hardship, bonds that only war could forge. Soldiers depended on each other for survival, creating a sense of brotherhood that remained long after they returned home. But alongside bravery came trauma. Many soldiers carried invisible wounds, the kind that lingered long after the war ended. Despite heavy casualties, the North Vietnamese remained unbroken. They fought with a level of commitment that surprised the world. To them, the war was not just a conflict. It was a struggle for identity, independence, and reunification. The more the U.S. escalated, the more determined the North became. It was a cycle of resolve versus firepower, ideology versus technology, endurance versus exhaustion. By the late 1960s, the Vietnam War had evolved into a tragedy of miscalculation and misunderstanding. The United States had entered the conflict believing its strength would guarantee victory. Instead, it faced a determined opponent willing to sacrifice everything. The middle years of the war revealed the limits of military power, the complexities of guerrilla tactics, and emotional weight carried by those who served. This was the phase of the war where reality became impossible to ignore, both on the battlefield and back home. The deeper America moved into Vietnam, the more the war revealed its brutal, unforgiving nature. What many strategists in Washington had believed would be a short and decisive mission was rapidly turning into a grinding conflict with no clear front lines. Villages that appeared peaceful during the day could become ambush zones at night. A single dirt trail could lead to a hidden tunnel network stretching for miles beneath the surface. The enemy wasn't just elusive. They were everywhere and nowhere at the same time. For American soldiers on the ground, Vietnam felt like stepping into another world. The thick, jungle-swallowed sound, light, and visibility. You could walk 3 feet ahead of your squad and still feel alone. The air was so heavy with humidity that even breathing felt like work. Sweat-soaked uniforms before breakfast. Leeches clung to skin. Mosquitoes never stopped biting. And every rustle in the leaves could be a Viet Cong soldier aiming a rifle from the shadows. Many young Americans arrived in Vietnam with a sense of duty, patriotism, and hope, but the reality that greeted them was unlike anything they had ever trained for. Back home, families turned on the evening news to see footage of the war that was becoming more graphic by the day. Helicopters lifting wounded soldiers, villages engulfed in flames, and reporters broadcasting live from the battlefield brought the harsh truth of Vietnam into living rooms across America. The war was no longer distant. It was suddenly personal. Mothers held their breath whenever the phone rang. Parents opened mail with shaking hands. The fear of losing a loved one became a constant companion. Meanwhile, in the jungles of South Vietnam, U.S. troops faced an enemy that refused to fight conventionally. The Viet Cong dug underground networks so extensive that entire units could vanish below the earth without leaving a trace. Booby traps were hidden everywhere, beneath bamboo leaves, inside rice paddies, along narrow trails. A soldier could be walking toward what looked like open ground one moment and be gone the next. These traps weren't just designed to injure, they were designed to demoralize. Despite the chaos, American soldiers relied on each other in ways that formed unbreakable bonds. In a place where every day could be your last, trust became more valuable than armor. Men from different states, races, and backgrounds stood shoulder to shoulder, knowing that survival depended on the person next to them. Letters from home, care packages, and the occasional USO show became lifelines, small reminders that the world outside the war still existed. The U.S. military, determined to seize control, increased bombing campaigns and ground operations. Massive airstrikes shook the earth, lighting the jungle canopy with fire. Artillery thundered through the mountains. Yet no matter how much force was used, the enemy continued to reappear. The war was becoming a test of willpower as much as firepower. Every soldier had a story. Moment of terror, quiet conversations under a dim moon, friendships born in the worst conditions imaginable. Some remember watching tracers streak across the night sky, like red and green fireworks, a sight both beautiful and terrifying. Others recalled sharing a single can of beans with their squad after a long patrol, laughing for the first time in months, because if they didn't laugh, they feared they'd break down. The deeper America pushed, the more the conflict took a toll, physically, mentally, and politically. What had begun as a mission to stop the spread of communism was turning into one of the most controversial wars in U.S. history. Yet for the men fighting it, the politics mattered far less than the simple goal of making it home alive. This was Vietnam, raw, relentless, and unforgettable. As the Vietnam War dragged on, exhaustion settled over men who had been fighting for months, sometimes years, in a place that often felt endless. For many American soldiers, the line between days and nights began to blur. Patrols through dense jungle felt like walking inside a green maze with no exit. Helicopter blades cutting through the air became the soundtrack of the war, a sound that meant rescue, danger, or something in between. Every soldier carried his own memories, some spoken, most buried deep inside where no one else could see. By the late 1960s, it was clear that this war had become unlike any America had fought before. Victory could not be measured by captured territory, because the territory changed hands constantly. It could not be measured by battles won, because every win seemed to lead to another ambush, another setback, another soldier lost. The enemy did not fight for ground. They fought for time, survival, and belief. And in that kind of war, every decision became heavier, every loss felt sharper. American forces continued their operations with determination, courage, and a hope that someday the conflict would end. At fire bases scattered across the countryside, soldiers watched sunsets fade into dark nights filled with the distant echo of artillery. Some wrote letters home, describing moments of quiet, pretending everything was okay so their families wouldn't worry. Others stare at photographs of loved ones tucked inside helmets, reminding themselves of the world waiting for them far beyond the jungle. But even in the darkest moments, there were flashes of humanity. Soldiers sharing rations, helping villagers rebuild homes damaged by fighting, comforting wounded comrades, or carrying each other through danger without hesitation. These acts of bravery and compassion became the heartbeat of the American experience in Vietnam. Proof that even in war, kindness could survive. As the years passed, the pressure grew back home. Protests spread across college campuses. The news reported rising casualties. Families demanded answers. The American public was torn between supporting the troops and questioning the war itself. It was a national struggle unlike anything the country had seen before. And for the young Americans serving thousands of miles away, that tension was felt deeply. They knew the world was changing while they were still fighting in the same unforgiving jungle. Finally, after years of conflict, negotiations, and a growing desire for peace, the United States began withdrawing troops. Soldiers packed their gear, boarded helicopters, and watched the landscape of Vietnam fade beneath them. Some with relief, others with guilt, many with memories that would stay with them forever. For countless men and women, the war did not end when they returned home. It followed them silently, in the form of nightmares, scars, and unanswered questions. Vietnam became a chapter in American history, written not only on battlefields, but in the hearts of those who lived through it. This conflict reshaped America, its politics, its culture, its military, and its understanding of war itself. It remains one of the most emotional and complicated chapters of U.S. history. And as we look back today, the stories of those who served deserve to be remembered with honesty, respect, and clarity. If you watched this far, thank you. Your support means everything. And if you want more powerful, deeply researched historical documentaries like this one, make sure to subscribe to the channel. It helps this content reach more people who care about history. Please like the video, share it with friends, leave your thoughts in the comments, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next chapter of our journey through America's past.